This podcast is kindly sponsored by Camera Museum of London at 44 Museum Street. Welcome to a Fish Out of Water podcast. This is your host, Richard Lipman. Today, we are interviewing Jack Endino.
Start video.
Okay, here we are.
Let me pull the tape off my camera.
Boom. Pin here. Jack, thanks for joining us. Yes, I can hear you.
Good. Okay, the Beta 58 is doing its job.
Good.
Let me prop it up on a book.
Thanks for joining us. This is the music podcast, and we have here Jack Endino, who's based in Seattle, Washington, and he's been a record producer since the
1985.
And I see that you have birds in the background and mountains and snowy mountains, ice, and is that correct? What does that signify? I mean,
you see a budgie poster on the wall, but it's not really representative. Not really representative of the Pacific Northwest skyline, however. Anyway, what
yes.
brings you to me here with your
I was doing some
podcasts, and what would you like to discuss?
Oh yeah, absolutely. We're going to discuss the history of music in Seattle since the 80s. We're going to discuss producing. We're going to discuss musicians. We're going to discuss demographics and maybe even equipment and genre and musicians. Your website, your work, philosophy. So I just want to start by asking you, can you tell us a bit about your background? Why were you brought up in Seattle?
No, I was not. I was actually lived in the state of Connecticut on the East Coast until I was 15, and then moved out here to Seattle with my parents because my mother's from this part of the country, actually. She was born in Oregon. And she always wanted to come back here. So at a certain point, my dad was able to get a transfer in his government job to an office out here in Seattle. So we all made the move. So been here since 74, approximately. So that makes me pretty much a native at this point.
Okay.
And graduated from the University of Washington with a degree in electrical engineering in 1980, worked at the Naval Shipyard in Bremerton, Washington for 2.5 years as a civilian electrical engineer. It took about as much of that as I could stand, and walked out of that job in summer of 83 and sort of woodshedded with some home recording equipment for a year or so. And got my first job in an actual recording studio in summer of 1986, which was Reciprocal Recording in Seattle. So, I just want to, in the meantime, I had a couple of bands, and here we are.
Right. And I just want to go back a bit, and can I ask, at school, were you popular when you were a teenager? Do you remember anything? Did you meet lots of friends? Did you were you a hard worker, or did you kind of move into the creative circles, if there was such a thing, at school?
No, I was one of the science geeks. I mean, my friends were other science geeks, and that would be late high school, really. There was probably a math club. I'm sure I was in it. There was a computer class. I'm sure I took it. It was I certainly wasn't going to the dances or any of that stuff, or going to the sports events.
Okay. And were there any musicians back then that people who were aspiring to be in bands when you were in school?
In my early school years before I moved out to Seattle, I think I was was right at the beginning of what we would call 11th grade. I was always in the school choir. I always volunteered to sing but I couldn't play an instrument. There were no musicians anywhere around me. I mean, my mom could play a little piano. That was about it. Uh, Once I got to Seattle, I was in a rural area actually where I finished high school. There was like one guy who had a band. His name was Kurt Kohlfeldt, actually, and many years later, I bought a wah wah pedal from him, which I still have. He was one of the people who moved to Los Angeles in 1981, because that's what you did when you were a musician in Seattle in the early 80s, is you got out of here. And he moved to LA. Duff McKagan, as we know, moved to LA. A few other people moved to LA. And Kurt ended up in a band called Holy Terror that was kind of a notorious death metal band that was on the early Road Racer records before they became Roadrunner. And those records that they put out in the mid 80s are kind of collectibles now, I gather. So Kurt eventually moved back to Seattle, and I ended up recording quite a few of his bands, and he was even in the band Zeke for a while. I just saw him the other day, actually, because Mr. Kurt Kohlfeldt just put out a record for a band that he has called Old Dirty Buzzard. And it's just, noisy metal punk is what I would call it, which, I mean, we probably recorded in 2 days or 3 days or whatever. Typical for that kind of thing anyway. So Kurt is still active, as am I.
Yeah.
But that would be the only musician that I know from my high school years, period.
Interesting. Have you heard of someone called Andrea Black?
No.
She was signed up, I think, she had a distribution deal through Roadrunner Records. Oddly enough, funny you mentioned that. So were you involved in the production of the previous album?
Of which album?
That you just showed us.
Oh, yeah. No, I recorded this record here kind of during the during the end of the lockdowns. Actually, they came to the studio and we banged it out in a couple of days. And I mastered it too, of course. No, I've worked with Kurt off and on for a long
Jack,
time.
you have an incredible website which details what it's like to be a producer, what it's like working with you, the engineering aspect, the mixing, the mastering, the noise mongering, your solo albums. I mean, sorry, your albums with your band, as well as working in the grunge scene in the 80s and 90s.
Right.
How you say that it's best to begin if you want to work, as someone who records music, to begin by yourself. Do you still agree with that philosophy?
Yeah, I think I do. I'm not in favor of school-based learning programs because I think you could. I mean, I was largely self-taught, and I didn't have to start my recording career $30,000 in debt to a for-profit recording school. You could take that money that you would spend on the tuition for a recording school, and you could buy half the gear you would need to have a studio yourself. I'm very much of a do-it-yourself sort of self-starting individual. I mean, I started by buying a 4-track reel-to-reel machine and just learning how to use it. And this was before the internet, but there were still books and magazines and resources and people you could ask. There's always somebody doing it. You just have to ask someone to start giving you tips. You just learn where you can. But I've never been in favor of the structured learning thing. Not after how I went through college, and I did pretty well in college, but I realized that I really didn't have to go to the classes very much. I just had to show up for the tests. As long as I did good on the tests, nobody cared if I was there. So I thought, well, I could do this on my own and just read the textbooks. So
Right.
I'm not a big fan of school-based learning. For some people, it works. For me, you just give me the knowledge. Let me read it. Let me absorb it. Let me start working with it. So your mileage may vary. My recommendation may not be for everybody, but I think the best way to get started in this, um, there's no formal requirements for being a recording engineer. It's really, I can tell you things that you should know. My electrical knowledge is good background because I have a sort of a scientific bent. Um, and I know I understand signal flow. I understand I took some classes. I understand the basic physics of sound and the basic physics of simple electronics, which audio is mostly fairly straightforward. Um, and I have pretty good troubleshooting ability. I was always like messing with a soldering gun when I was a little kid. So,
Okay.
being a geek helps obviously, but being a musician helps just as much. Because you got to know what's happening on both sides of the glass. Um,
What,
but
what I see. What does it? What's a good ear to you? What makes a good ear?
I don't know. Taste, aesthetic, experience, wide ranging musical knowledge. I started consuming popular music as a fan and record collector in 1971, and I just digested everything I could get for 15 years or so before I was ever actually working as a recording engineer. But I digested the minutia of what was on um, these rock records and how they'd been recorded and who were the producers, what were the studios, what were the engineers doing, how did they get these sounds. I just needed to know all of it. So you have to have sort of an analytic set set of ears, I guess, that helps.
Was there
uh,
a particular, sorry to interrupt, was there a particular um scenario in a studio that you aspired to record in? For example, the way Elvis Presley was being recorded in, with sometimes having an audience and then only a few microphones, or was that a scenario that you saw?
no, not at all. I had no interest in doing what other people were doing other than not making mistakes. I had to work out a basic approach for myself by trial and error. And once you make the errors, you only make them once. And so you sort of refine your direction based on your own personal aesthetic of how you want things to sound. Like I mic a guitar amp this way because that's the kind of sounds that I'm looking for that I think are good guitar tones. Or I put the mic this far from the snare drum because I like the way the tone of the snare is with this particular mic in this particular position. Now, there may be times when you do other things depending on the music or the band or the style or whatever, but you have to sort of hone your own way of working, um, because you can't just experiment all the time on the client's money or you'll never get anything done. um, Part of working in the indie rock world is working with low budgets because there's no multinational corporations financing 99% of my clients. So it is my responsibility to work as quickly and efficiently as I can. So I sort of know what works with a given sort of band or sort of sound or kind of style. I can just go right for, okay, these mics, this kind of miking, uh, this kind of reverb, this kind of vocal mic. But it's different with everyone. But it's all about experience really, and learning what worked before and
Right.
thinking that it might work again.
So down to the specifics, right at the beginning, you said you had a 4-track, you had a few mics. Does that do you still use the same kind of gear or approach? What kind of mics would you use? Where would you mic up for, mics? Especially if the music is so loud, wasn't there a lot of leakage and stuff? How would that affect the recording?
Well, learning how to record on a 4-track machine with a band, once you learn how to do that well, sorry, that was my cell phone tweeting at me. Move that away from the mic. Once you learn how to do it with minimal tracks, um, expanding to, you know, larger recording scenarios is really quite simple, because you've learned how to do it the hard way. With a 4-track setup, I had a 6-channel mixing board, and I had a handful of mics, mostly SM58s. You mic the drums with maybe 3 mics, maybe a snare, a kick, and one hanging from the ceiling, and combine them with the mixer to one track. And then you have a mic on the bass, a mic on the guitar amp, and a mic on the singer. And that's how some of the first Skin Yard album was actually recorded. I think 3 or 4 of the songs on that album were 4-track recordings that, you can sort of pan things a little when you mix it and maybe put some stereo reverb on it to create the illusion that it's not, 4 completely mono tracks. But, if it sounds good and the playing is good and the feeling is there, and it doesn't, penalize the ear when you turn it up, no one questions it. It's just, oh, that's a good recording. It sounds good. They might not analyze it and realize there's only one guitar track and one bass track and one vocal track. Most of the Bleach album is that way, even though we had an 8-track recording, 8 tracks to work with. People say it's raw, but it still sounds good. I mean, if the sounds are good, the sounds are good, no matter how many tracks there are.
100%.
So, learning how to do it on 4 tracks was very useful for me for a few years, instead of just being thrown into a professional studio situation and, learning how to use a lot of it wrongly.
Well, with 4 tracks, right? I mean, but you could only there's only 4 inputs, right? Is that correct? When you say
yes, 4? Yeah, you have to have an external mixer to sum things together. So I was able to use up to 6 microphones. You could make 3 of those microphones, the 3 drum mics, you could put them on one track by sending it out of the mixer into an aux send or whatever kind of summed output you have. That's what a mixer does.
Oh, yeah, right. So how many mics were mic'd up during the Bleach recording, for example?
I would say probably a stereo overhead pair, 1 mic on each of the 3 toms, a kick mic, and a snare mic. And so that's probably 1, 2, 3, 4, probably 7 mics. I might have had a mic on the bottom of the snare, but I don't think I was doing that very much then. So I probably had 7 mics. I took the kick, put it on its own track. I put the snare on its own track, and I took the stereo overheads and the 3 tom mics and combined them together onto a stereo submix, which went onto another 2 tracks. So the drums were on a total of 4 tracks: kick, snare, and stereo of the rest of the drum set minus the kick and snare. So, which is pretty deluxe for an 8-track recording, because you're using half the channels on the tape.
The others? What about
and then there was a bass track, a guitar track, and a vocal track, and on most of it we had an extra track left over that didn't get used.
So did you put the microphone in front of the amplifier?
Where else would you put it?
Exactly. Well, yes.
I mean, it's an amp. There's a mic. You put the mic in front of the amp. I mean, where you put it is a matter of personal taste.
Was there okay? And of course, the vocalist at the time, Kurt Cobain, he was singing through an amplifier. Is that correct?
No, Kurt did his vocals after the band recorded instrumentally.
Oh, I see. So it wasn't live.
You're not a recording engineer, I can tell.
No,
so I'm explaining it as though to a newbie here. Yeah, the band recorded instrumentally. He had a sort of a guide vocal mic setup, which was probably not recorded. It was just so he could call out the cues to the band, okay, solo here, verse here. And after the instrumental tracks were done, then he just went out to a microphone by himself and just ran through the songs, recording the vocals on each one after another.
During that session, I read somewhere that the whole album was recorded in one day. Is that correct?
Incorrect. No, it was recorded over a series of evening sessions, actually. Um, what you're probably thinking of is my initial session with them in January of 1988, during which they came in and recorded 10 songs with me in one afternoon with Dale Crover from the Melvins on drums. Now, this was before they even called themselves Nirvana. But that was their first demo that they did with me. We call it the Dale demo because he drummed on it. About half of that material ended up on Incesticide years later, and another 2 tracks got remixed and added onto the Bleach record, actually, which we did a year after that. And I think a couple more songs ended up on the box set. So most of that stuff got used, but that was a quick session. I mean, they did everything in a couple of hours, did the vocals in one pass. I mixed the whole thing in about an hour, if you call it mixing, because it was understood that it was a demo. They just wanted to get some songs down so they could get some shows. Bleach, on the other hand, was done probably in a total of 30 or so build hours of studio time, but it was like 4 hours here, 5 hours there, a series of evenings, one of which I think was even Christmas Eve. I'd have to go look at the log sheets, which are somewhere, and verify that, but we were working right around the holidays at the end of 1988, just a series of evenings that we did. And I think I totaled it up to be something like 30 hours of total time, which would be, 3 10-hour days or 2 really, really long days.
And the writing of the songs, do you think they were well rehearsed? What do you
Yeah,
think?
completely. Everything was well rehearsed. The only thing that wasn't entirely finished was some of the lyrics. He was actually putting the finishing touches on the lyrics right before walking up to the microphone. I could see him grab a piece of paper because, maybe, or he had just written them and needed to make sure that he had them so he didn't forget what they were. So some of that was fresh, but the music was not. The music they'd been playing for most of that summer, I think. So we're going to talk about something other than Nirvana, are we not?
Of course, absolutely.
This tends to overshadow everything I've done
Absolutely.
since 1989.
No, we're gonna move into various parts of your work. Absolutely. Just one thing before we move on. What was the feeling you had in the room? And did you communicate with the musicians, or was it just all about the music back then? Did you have to make notes, change, change things? Did you give advice or not? Or do you say, oh, can you try it this way or that way? Or was it just a straight recording?
I gave a little advice. I mean, mostly uh they were going to use a song called Blandest for the B side of their first 7-inch, and I advised them to use a different song because Blandest was frankly a fairly bland song. And I said, no, you really should use this other song. It's much catchier, which they did, which I think was Big Cheese, actually, which was a much better tune. So I'll take full responsibility for that. Other than that, I didn't have to tell them how to play the songs or what tempos to do or anything. At best, I probably grabbed a drum key and helped Chad tune the drums. I probably Kurt was using my guitar amp for most of Bleach, so I probably dialed in the settings for him. Um, I just made sure things sounded good and then got out of the way, which is, what you sort of should do. Uh,
And
I wasn't calling myself a record producer in 1988. I'd only been a recording engineer for a year and a half at that point.
I see. So working with at the time Nirvana, did that help with other recordings? For example, did the label come back to you with and said, we'd like you to record this band and that
No,
band?
no, I was already doing that stuff for the label at that point.
Oh, I see.
They were nobody at that time.
Right.
You have to remember they were nobody. They were just another indie band, not of any particular significance, nobody's favorite band at that point. The Bleach record itself didn't come out for another year and a half, which was summer of '89 sometime, maybe spring. And, even then they didn't become famous until the end of 1991 when their major label record came out. So, they were just another indie band. Meanwhile, I'd been recording Soundgarden for like a year,
Wow.
and they were getting much more attention actually, as well as a lot of the other early Sub Pop stuff that I ended up doing around the same time. So, the Nirvana came along a little bit after things were already going pretty strong here.
Did you have an initial feeling about Kurt Cobain? Did you think, oh, something there?
Yeah, I liked his singing and I liked his songwriting, but then what's that mean? I like a lot of people, and it doesn't mean they're going to be famous. Personally, I liked them, and we invited them to open for my band a few times, which was Skin Yard. Actually, I think they opened for us, I think 4 times, and the 5th time we opened for them, things had changed. It was Europe, whatever, but still.
And did you ever meet? Of course, you must have met Bruce Pavitt and Jonathan Poneman. Is that correct?
Poneman. Of course, yeah, they were the people who started the Sub Pop label, so I had regular dealings with them.
Did they come to you, or did you come to them, or was it a natural, organic process?
The bands came to me. They followed the bands.
And they followed, right. Did they ever come into the studio?
Extremely rarely. I don't think Bruce Pavitt ever came to the studio. Now, I might not remember it. Jonathan Poneman came in a couple of times, but he didn't stick around. They were smart enough to stay out of the studio and just leave us to get on with it. I still deal with Sub Pop now sometimes. It's mostly with archival stuff. I'm doing a bunch of remixes for the band The Fluid, who were on Sub Pop in the late 80s and early 90s. I'm remixing some of their back catalog right now, actually. There was the Soundgarden Ultra Mega reissue that Sub Pop did. Of course, that wasn't my record initially, but the band had me remix it because they weren't that happy with how it sounded. And Sub Pop reissued that, and I did some mixing of some Mudhoney rarities and some U-Men rarities. And as this archival stuff comes up a lot now, and I get the phone call, whether I worked on it originally or not, I sort of have an understanding of the historical period, if you will.
They say, I've been watching the Hype documentary, and there was someone showing us examples of what it was like to play. But if I bring my guitar, I can't remember it exactly. And of course, this is more of a sort of bluesy guitar, etc. They were playing a riff, and it sounded like rock and roll, and then said, well, grunge is a variation of this riff and that riff. At the time, back in the 80s, did you feel that there was a sort of new genre when you were starting out and recording all these local bands?
I think a few of us felt that way. This has been beaten to death in the press before, because it was aesthetically what was going on was kind of a sort of a mix of 70s hard rock aesthetic musically with early 80s punk and post-punk attitude and politics grafted on top of what was basically 70s hard rock, with a little bit of post-punk, British post-punk edginess added onto it, because people who grew up on Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath, but who followed along into the world of Joy Division and Killing Joke and King Crimson, late King Crimson and so forth, and the Talking Heads. It's sort of, I think people took these influences, and Black Flag, it has to be said, and of course the earlier ones like the Stooges, people who threw all that stuff into a blender ended up kind of coming up with a sort of a new flavor of heavy rock, and it needed a name because it wasn't hair metal, it wasn't arena rock, it wasn't exactly your Big Brothers heavy metal from the 70s, and it wasn't quite punk rock anymore. It was too slow. So, sooner or later, people had to come up with a handle for it, to just so we'd know what we were talking about when we referred to it, because there was a regional sound developing, but it wasn't just in Seattle. There was kind of a, I would say SST Records in California had a big part in sort of jump starting the American indie rock, do it yourself, record for cheap, put out a record yourself kind of scene that was taking shape in 84, 85, 86. And then in the late 80s, inspired by the success of a few small pioneering labels like SST, Discord in DC, Alternative Tentacles in San Francisco, Wax Tracks in Chicago, these various labels inspired a lot of other people to start labels. So almost every major city had a couple of indie labels trying to put out local independent music. It was kind of a thing in the late 80s. Maybe the economics of it were such that it was actually possible to do this. Few of those labels ended up surviving over the long term, but many of them lasted long enough to at least make a splash. And Sub Pop is still around. Ultimately, they had to get outside investors in at some point back in the late 90s in order to survive, but they've kept their own control over what they do. SST is still around in some form, but they don't do much. I think Discord Records is still around. Twin Tone and Touch and Go, I don't believe they are still doing anything. Alternative Tentacles still exists, but there's a lot of other labels that have sort of fallen by the wayside. So, anyway, it was, I'm getting off the whatever the question was, but, there was a sort of a thing going on in the late 80s, and the sort of grunge thing we talked about was Seattle's slice of it, but it was part of a bigger picture. So I've got a siren going by.
Oh, sorry about that.
Yeah, it was, the Seattle thing was part of a bigger picture that was going on.
Do you think they well, the documentary mentions that winters are quite hard in Seattle. At the time in the 80s, there was a certain, I think it was a lot of people were struggling in Seattle, and versus the the uber rich and technologies coming in. Did that affect the atmosphere? There weren't that many live music venues. People were much more receptive, though, when they did hear bands back then. Was there more enthusiasm for innovation and experimentation?
I'm not sure I understand your question. Can you crystallize that a little bit more?
Sure. I'm just wondering, are things different now in comparison with the 80s in terms of the music scene?
It's a silly question 40 years later.
Yes.
Yeah, things are quite different. The entire economy and cultural makeup of the city has completely shifted. It's now a company town. Pretty much 40% of the office space in this city is owned by Amazon. So there's no comparison to how it was in the 80s when it was mostly a Boeing town. Boeing aircraft. Microsoft wasn't yet any sort of factor, I don't think. The whole computer industry didn't even exist yet. No, this was largely a shipbuilding and airplane building corner of the United States, and fishing and lumber, logging, and the Alaska fishing boats always come into Seattle too. That's the other thing. So culturally, there's no comparison. It's a completely different. I mean, it's been a couple of generations down now. Everything's different now. The politics, the economy, it's all changed.
Also, you have quite a large Christian community, right? With or am I confusing it with Salt Lake City? Of course.
I think you're confusing it with Salt Lake City. That would be
okay.
That's definitely not a problem here.
Yeah, and it could certainly. I mean, Christian rock, for example, is quite successful in America, right? That kind of
Not
genre.
that I've heard. I mean, I certainly don't hear about it if it is. It's news to me. I'm not sure what you're reading.
Okay. In terms of equipment back in the 80s and today, have things gotten easier? Has the mentality shifted? Do you think it's too easy to make records today on your own without necessarily needing engineering or production? A lot of people easily call themselves producers. You know, they go to school and then they set up their own home studio and they're producers. And they work with all sorts of labelless artists. Is that, and TikTok, social media, the internet, has this democratized? I mean, have things gotten better, do you think, for the music scene?
In that sense, that anybody can do it very easily on their own if they want to. Um, it's very different knowing how to write your own songs as opposed to knowing how to record your own songs. That's two different skill sets entirely. So people that are the great musicians are not necessarily the best people at recording themselves, but nonetheless, it's democratized. The tools are democratized. It's much easier. You can spend $1,000 and have a very good, home recording system if you can learn the software and get a couple good mics and an interface. It's very simple to do that. The barriers are very, very low. At the same time, I have more work than I've ever had in my entire career, because people record on their own. They certainly did a lot of it during the pandemic, but at a certain point, they realize they need professional help. And then I get the call to help them mix it down or master it or whatever, because they don't have the experience and they can only take it so far. The typical musician is only going to make one or two albums if they're lucky to make any albums at all. One or two albums in an entire career would be very typical. And maybe a lot less than that would be the average. And I've worked on like 800 of them by now, at least. So I'm qualified for this work.
Hey.
But the actual home recording engineer might be a really good singer or guitarist, but may not be the best at engineering. So on the other hand, there's plenty of people who are learning how to do amazing work that would never have had the chance to do it before because they couldn't afford a studio or the equipment that was involved. It really comes down to when you have to give it to Tascam, I think, TIAC company, because who I think are part of Panasonic. I'm not sure about that. Who
right.
basically kind of democratized things with the first affordable, easy to use home 4-track reel-to-reel setups that you could do what's called the simul-sync, meaning you could record multi-track one channel at a time, and still stay synchronized with with what was on the other channels on the tape by using the array. Use the record head as a playback head while you were doing your recordings, and then you'd switch to the repro head when you were mixing it. That was somewhat of an innovation in the 70s.
Can I just pause you there? Sorry about that. I'm running out of Zoom time. Can I send another email with the new Zoom, and then we're going to talk about the Tascam, and then your Latin Grammy and Nando Rees, and I would be interested in hearing about your process.
Yeah, we need to move along here. I don't have that much time for you. We're going a little too wide range here. Yeah, go ahead. Send me a link.
Yes, we'll do in a couple of minutes. Thanks.
All right.
Hi, thanks, Jack, for joining us. How did you meet Nando Rees?
In 1993, which was when things were getting interesting. Skinyard had broken up, and I had decided that I was just going to be a record producer for a while. The sort of grunge wave was going outward from Seattle, and these kind of ripples would go out and reflections would come back. And one of those ripples from what was going on in Seattle, there's another siren going by.
Oh, interesting. I can't hear it, but yes, it must be.
I can hear it. It's
All
very
right.
loud. I live right next to a busy street. There's a firehouse nearby. So one of those ripples reached Brazil, actually, and there was a band there named Titãs, which in Portuguese means the Titans. And they were signed to Warner Brazil and had made albums since, I think, 1983. They were a pretty established band, one of the bigger bands in Brazil, actually, singing in Portuguese. So you didn't hear about them in the United States or really anywhere outside of Brazil and Portugal. But nonetheless, Brazil is a pretty big market. It has about 2/3 of the population of the U.S. And there's a whole giant music scene there that we don't hear about. Um, anyway, I got a call from someone from Warner International, which is the umbrella organization that oversees all the various Warner Brothers affiliates in each country.
Mm,
Um, and saying, hey, there's this band in Brazil who want to get a hold of you and talk about you producing a record for them. And I thought, Brazil, huh? What the heck? Um, and one thing led to another, and I ended up producing, I think, 5 albums for this band,
right.
Titãs, between 1993 and 2005. Um, and the bass player for that band was Nando Reis, and he left the band in 2002 and went solo. And I had already done a solo record for him because the various members of Titãs, like any established band, they always find time between tours for people to do, solo projects. The other members of the band, a few of them had solo projects as well. So Nando had a solo record. And then he had a second solo record, which I helped him with around 1999 or 2000. Um, and and that record did fairly well. And then after the next Titãs record I did in around 2001, it was called A Maior Banda de Todos os Tempos da Última Semana, which means the best band of all time of last week. Definitely a band with an ironic sense of their place in the world. It turned out to be a huge record in Brazil. But Nando left the band after that to pursue his solo career, and I've been working with him ever since. I've worked on, I think this makes 5 of his 8 or 9 solo records that he's made since that time. So I guess I've been working with Nando for 30 years, since 1993. When he was just the bass player for Titãs, but there was a song that he sang. They all took turns singing. There were 4 singers in the band. And so everybody got to sing a couple of songs on the record, on each album. So Nando was the pop guy in the band. The rest of them kind of wanted to be hard rockers, I think.
Mm,
So
mm.
he had to go off on his own finally. And now he's actually more successful, I think, than the original band is. And he's had a lot of his songs recorded by other people, other artists in Brazil. So he's actually known as much for being a songwriter as he is for being a solo performer. So and I just finished literally a few hours ago this morning. I was out in my studio making some final adjustments on 2 songs that we just finished mixing here. And I mailed them to the mastering engineer actually just right before talking to you, and hopefully the album is done. And it'll be a triple vinyl LP.
Wow. Was that a very intense process mastering?
Well, I was mixing.
I
The
mean,
mastering, I'm not doing the mastering on this one, which is good because I've spent a lot of time and effort on the mixing. And I handed the mastering off. We handed the mastering off to my old friend Chris Hanzik, who's been mastering longer than I have. He was the one that started Reciprocal Recording back in 1984, actually. But so he's mastering the record, and I just was communicating with him just a few minutes ago on the phone. And he's mastered quite a few of the Brazilian records that I've worked on. And sometimes when I do a lot of mastering on my own, but he was the guy that was doing it first. And a lot of times, if I've been working really, really, really hard on a record, I have no objectivity anymore.
Mm, mm.
It's good to get somebody else to do it.
Yes, yes. With Titas, did you fly over to Brazil to record?
Yeah, I made 4 of the 5 Titãs records involved me traveling to Brazil. One of them, they came to Seattle, and that was kind of a holiday for everybody. But the other records, I spent extended amounts of time in Brazil. Actually, I learned a fair bit of Portuguese in the process, which I'm in the process of forgetting now. But I had a good time. It was, I had some adventures in Brazil. It was good.
Can you give us an example of adventures?
Well, for instance, we were recording at one point, I think in 95, I think it was. And Titãs, as a band, plays all the time. And sometimes they would stop the recording session for a weekend and go play a show. So I got to see them play live shows. One weekend, they said, "Oh, we're flying to Argentina to play a show." And now they sing in Portuguese, so I thought this was interesting. They're going to a Spanish-speaking country. Well, what they were doing was opening for a bigger band from Brazil called Paralamas do Sucesso. And Paralamas was interesting because their lead singer, Herbert Viana, is fluent in Spanish as well as Portuguese. So Paralamas, who are Brazilian, recorded a special version of their album in Spanish. And it was released in Chile and Argentina and maybe a few other places. So they were able to go and play big shows in Argentina. And they took Titãs along as an opening band. So I got to watch Titãs playing in a soccer stadium, opening for their friends Paralamas, who, I met them in Brazil. They were both sort of a similar stature in Brazil, but Paralamas could sing in Spanish. And so, but Titãs opened for them singing in Portuguese and got a very respectful, nice response from the audience, I thought, considering they probably weren't very well known in Argentina. And I got to tag along in a small chartered plane, which I think was the first time I ever flew in a small plane. So that was entertaining. And another time we did a live recording, and we did a live recording in 2005 where the band did a special show at a historical site, which was an old Spanish fortress out on the coast of southern Brazil on an island called Florianopolis. And it was like a big, almost like a castle, an old Portuguese fortress. And they set up a portable stage, and the MTV Brazil set up a bunch of cameras and booms and so forth. And I got to record the whole thing multi-track and later mix it down, synchronized with video. And I even had to do a surround mix of it, the only time I've ever done that. And so that was the whole adventure. Was, it was a beautiful remote part of Brazil that I'd never heard about before. It was lovely. So, overlooking the ocean, the sun was setting. It was setting behind the band. It was lovely.
What about the ethos of the musicians inside the studio? What was it like? Do you think the atmosphere is different? The way people work is different?
In Brazil?
In Brazil.
Well, okay, I've worked a lot in South America. I've worked in Chile. I've worked in Argentina. I've worked in Brazil. Multiple records in these places. And nobody works as hard as I'm used to people working here. In fact, they think I'm a little crazy because I will work from noon until midnight. And they think I'm out of my mind. I mean, right. They will work from, maybe, 11 p.m. until 8, and they'll take a lunch break in the middle of it. It's very humane, which is, that's kind of delightful for me because I'm used to the, 11 to 11 or whatever. I do 12 hours. I'll take a food break. And it's silly, really. I should work less. The best part, I remember one time, with Titãs, I was working in the studio and I suddenly realized that the band had disappeared. I was in the control room by myself. I thought, well, where did everybody go? And I went down the hallway from the studio main room to the lounge, which was in the front of the building. and there was a soccer game on the television, and the whole band, 7 guys, were glued to this soccer game, just screaming at the television, just going, Wah! And I thought, okay, I'm definitely in Brazil now. Soccer is very important. So that wouldn't happen in Seattle.
Hmm.
So just an example. But by and large, no. I mean, even the bands I work with, by and large, they're other than the fact that they have kids and wives and so forth, and you have to sort of coordinate things around, oh, I've got to get the kids at school or go to the soccer game or whatever, with my kid. By and large, they're still professional musicians, and they will work as hard as they can in the studio. Once you're an established band with record company money, though, you don't have to quite work as relentlessly as you do when you're an indie band and you have to make a record for $2,000. I say to people, I can work fast if you can, and it's true. If I have to work fast, I'm capable of it. I know exactly how to kick things along. But the larger bands like Titãs, it was a little more humane. There was a caterer who came and brought us food. I had a nice hotel. A driver who would come and pick me up at the hotel every morning. And these things are nice, but I didn't get too many of those in my career. Really, it was kind of deluxe,
Right.
actually. I'm thinking, oh, I'm in Rio, and the food's great, the people are nice. What's not to like? Don't drink the
What about
water.
the equipment? Did you have assistants, engineering
Yeah.
assistants? Right.
Yes, absolutely.
Right.
Assistants, good equipment, everything. I mean, this was an established band. They had proper budgets. We could spend 5 weeks making a record instead of 5 days. Um, so that was kind of
Okay.
deluxe times, actually. I got
Um,
to,
right.
what's
Um,
going on there?
hang on. I've got
What are you
this.
doing?
Can I call you back in 10 minutes? Sorry about
Yeah,
that. Sorry about that. Yeah, no,
you're running.
no, it's all good. Don't worry about it. I'm doing a documentary about a musician, and her cousin is here from San Francisco. So I told him I'll call him back in 10 minutes. And
Okay.
he's leaving tomorrow. But that's great. That's very interesting. What and the actual process of recording, do you ensure that the band or what about actually getting along with them on a personal level? How important is that as a as
It's useful. If you don't have a personal simpatico, you're not going to get much done. I get along with most everybody because I'm not hard to get along with, really. I only get impatient if people talk too much when I'm trying to work, or if people don't show up at the studio and don't tell me. I mean, I'm here to do a job. Let's not waste time. So as long as people are serious and actually want to be there, it's when people are in the studio and you can tell they don't want to be in the studio that it's a little strange for me. It hasn't happened very often, though. Occasionally I find myself in the studio with somebody who was, maybe a label told them they need to record right now, and I quickly realize that they're not prepared and they don't even know why they're there. But that's only happened a couple of times in my whole career. It's weird when it happens.
right.
I have to say, like, why are you guys here right now? You don't have any songs.
What, what,
you
what
know,
about what
but that's
about
not my problem, really.
what about things like audiences? Have you ever been in a situation where there's audiences in the studio? Does that help other people? So, for example, Yoko Ono used to be in some of the Beatles recording sessions towards the end of the time. There were other people hanging around. Is that good, do you think, for the musicians?
It might be good for the musicians. It's not great for the engineer, but I've dealt with it quite a few times, actually, and I even record live shows sometimes. No, I've dealt with it in the studio. You just have to police it a little bit to make sure they're not putting their drinks down next to the console, and that nobody's spilling food on the floor, and that they're not tripping over cables. I mean, there's a lot that can go wrong in the studio. When people bring their dogs in,
Mm.
or their 3-year-olds, you know what I mean, or something like that, and you're kind of going, no, 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 don't go over there, don't touch that button. That's not really that sort of stuff doesn't really belong in a studio. There's too much that can go wrong.
Uh,
But if dealing with an audience, that can be fun. I've done it. You just have to just sort of put your blinders on and focus on the work you're doing and try not to let it distract you,
what
because
makes what makes a successful song? Do you feel it immediately? Do you know when it's they've got something?
yes, I would say a good rhythmic groove of some kind with some kind of swing, something that makes you tap your foot or bob your head. You know what I mean? There has to be a feel, a rhythmic feel to it. It can't be stiff. And I would say interesting chord progressions, or some sort of musical bed or framework that has some kind of interest, some kind of a hook that sticks in your head, and melody is useful but not absolutely essential. I like a good melody as much as anybody. I'm really a pop guy, so I think back on classic rock like the Beatles and Zeppelin and CCR and so forth. And I think, well, there was always a melody, a bridge, a hook, a verse, a chorus, an intro. The song would go from point A to point B. There was always, each song would take you on a little journey. That's a classic sort of pop approach to songwriting. And I sort of, you can't really go wrong with that sort of stuff. If you don't have those elements in your music, you have to work a little harder to make it interesting in other ways.
And finally, what is success and what is failure in in terms of music for you as a record producer?
Hmm.
And also you have your own band, right? And you've several albums have been out there. You've also gigged quite a lot as well.
Yeah. So
But
what
first,
is
yes.
yeah, go ahead. What is success? I mean, I don't know. What is success? I mean, I'm still working when I should be retiring. Um, but on the other hand, I'm working at work that isn't really work to me, even though I work incredibly hard. I love my job. So you could say that I have as much success as I need, really. I have meaningful work and I enjoy doing it. That who can, what can I say? I'm blessed in that respect, that I have a niche career that I wouldn't trade it for anything. Um, at the same time, most of what I do is very much under the radar culturally. It's very seldom that anything I do has any sort of wider impact on the culture anymore. There was a brief period in the early '90s when the stuff I was doing made kind of a splash, but for the most part, I just keep doing what I'm doing, and it just sort of perpetuates itself. Um, so that's as much success as I need personally. Now, none of my musical projects have had any kind of wider success. Skinyard has sort of established itself as kind of a cult band, if you will. People have gone back to those records we made 30 years ago and listened to them, and there's still a certain amount of people who find us online, and the stuff's up on Spotify and Bandcamp and so forth. And but nobody's making a living on any of the music that we made. Now some of the bigger artists I know, the people in Soundgarden and the ex-members of Nirvana, the guys in Pearl Jam and so forth, they make a living with music, but they've devoted their entire lives to it 24/7, and they deserve it. The rest of us who were more, casual, we were indie players, we were on small labels, we toured a few times, made a few albums, got it out of our system, as it were. I still play in bands just for the fun of it. I have a band called Purple Strange that just made a record. I have another band called Beyond Captain Orca, which has a Bandcamp site. It's an improv trio, and we still play. And I'm in a band called Sky Cries Mary, actually, that I'm about to make my, I think, third or fourth album since I've been playing with these guys. And we never play live. It's just a recording project at this point. So, and the label makes like 200 copies of the vinyl, and it goes up digitally, and nobody hears about it. It's a cult band. And that's fine. It's how much success do you need?
Okay, we'll end on that. Thank you very much, Jack. It's been a pleasure. And we can visit Jack on the internet, www.endino.com.
Endino.com works, yes, and jackendino.bandcamp.com for more of the actual musical projects, even though most people know me as a record producer. There's still the guitar playing sometimes.
Absolutely. Thanks very much.
Alrighty. Well, I hope that was pleasurable for you.
It was. Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, I got to get on with my day. I'll talk to you later.
Okay. All the best. Take care. Thanks.
Yep. Oh.
This podcast is kindly sponsored by Camera Museum of London at 44 Museum Street. Thank you for listening to A Fish Out of Water podcast. This is your host, Richard Lippman. Should you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please get in touch.